Great Writers Media.
I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, join us as we welcome an outstanding author. His name is Barry Gold, and he has written a thought-provoking book. It is called We're Overdosed. In this insightful work, the author dives into the history of opium, the development of opioids, and the global pharmaceutical industry's birth, all while offering perspectives on gaining control of prescription opioids through federal legislation and addressing the tragic overdose epidemic. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Great Writers Media for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his wonderful book. The links are below this interview. Barry, great to see you here today.
Thank you, Logan. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. This is such an important work. Everybody either knows someone who died from an opioid addiction or overdose at this point, or knows somebody who knows somebody. It's like 1 degree of separation. It's that bad. Why isn't more being done to stop this? In the 70s, we had the war on drugs, and it seems like we made headway. And now here we are in 2023, and it's a nightmare out there for parents. Tell us what's going on.
Well, there's a statistic, I think, that pinpoints what's going on. In the year 2022, last year, 111,000 Americans died from opiate overdose, 70% of which showed fentanyl in their system. That is scary.
Yeah. It's a chilling statistic. And like I said, I've got a guy down the block, his son died. My sister's best friend, her son died. A colleague, his granddaughter died. I mean, people are dying in record numbers, it seems, from drug overdoses, fentanyl overdoses, which is easy to do because it's such a toxic, lethal drug. Why aren't we doing more to stop it? I mean, it's here, it's at our doorstep, it's knocking at our door.
I look back 2 years ago, we suffered a COVID epidemic, and all of us ran out, or many of us ran out and were immunized against it, and we got our booster shots, and we wore masks, and we stopped going to work, and we stopped going to restaurants, and we treated it as an epidemic. Mm-hmm. And yet, the year that COVID struck the United States, we lost fewer than 100,000 people. And now we're losing 111,000 a year, and it increases yearly.
Right.
And we're doing nothing. I don't want to beg the question, why aren't we doing anything? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think the issue has to do with leadership. And I don't mean there's a lack of it. I mean, no one is focused on the public health issue that opiates present.
Yeah. It's bizarre.
It's a matter of a missing leadership.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't even seem like it's part of the lexicon or the dialogue in the 2024 race for the presidency. I mean, it seems like all we talk about is immigration. Immigration seems like all we talk about. Inflation, we talk about the economy. But, like you said, more than 100,000 people a year are dying. And these are not old people in a nursing home who are going to die within a year or two anyway, as it was in COVID. These are young, vital people who are dying, who are the next generation. We have a reduced generation in size coming up anyway, and that number is getting smaller because of opioids. What sparked your interest in this subject?
Well, bear in mind that I am a pharmacologist. Pharmacology is not pharmacy. I don't count pills. I tell you how they work.
Right.
It's a medical subject, and I taught medical school early in my career. I did not achieve tenure, and I left and I went into the pharmaceutical industry. I'm not afraid to say that, but it's many years ago. I think the issue is first of all, it's impossible to oversimplify the issue. If I open my mouth, I'm oversimplifying the issue. But I think why are we not doing anything? Why are so many people dying? Why is there no leadership? Why? We ask the question ad nauseum. I think the government is focused, as you said, on immigration, on the war in Ukraine, on the war in Israel, on the war in Gaza, on God knows what.
Right.
And no one's out there screaming, other than me, saying people, 111,000 a year are dying due to opiate. Let's talk about it. It's a public health issue.
Mm.
And that is a favorite theme of mine. It is not a criminal. Drug abusers are not criminals.
Yeah,
They're sick,
absolutely.
they're sick people who need public health care.
Or they're kids messing around one night, taking a pill of something and killing themselves accidentally. You know what I mean? So it's an awful, awful thing. Do you feel pharmaceutical companies are doing enough to rein in their drugs that are being misused?
Oh, I think finally they are. I mean, we had an era of uh, copycat marketing. If a certain company in Connecticut was marketing oxycodone and making billions at it, then we ought to have, speaking as a pharmaceutical person, we ought to have an opiate because that's a huge market.
Mm.
And they completely forgot that there's a moral issue associated with introducing a new opiate, and that is that people abuse them. So, is the industry doing anything? I think they are now. I would still maintain that there's too many opiates on the market, too many opioids on the market. We don't need 12 drugs that you can inject, or 12 drugs that you can rub on the skin, or 12 drugs that you can take orally. I think 3 and 3 might be enough,
Right.
but I'm not making policy.
Exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
only proposing it.
So there's a place and time where people will need opioids and opiates because of pain.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Cancer patients are in horrible pain.
Mm.
And as moral good citizens, we can't let a cancer patient be in pain just because that cancer patient will become dependent on the drug we're giving him.
Mm.
We have to say to the cancer patient, here, take this. We recognize it's a drug of abuse. You're sick. You must take this so you can function. Similarly, when I fell a few months ago and broke a rib, I took an oxycodone. I didn't like it, but
Mm.
I took it.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can let people be in pain. But on the other hand, if you speak to an addict and say, why did you start? The first thing the addict says is, I felt lousy. I had to get rid of that lousy feeling.
Mm.
Well, what's that lousy feeling? That lousy feeling, I I believe, stems from loneliness. And that opens a whole other subject about the United States.
Yeah.
We're becoming an asocial country. We stare at screens.
Yeah.
We don't talk to each other.
Yeah. And also we ignore mental health issues as well.
Sadly, mental health issues are stigmatized by the public still.
Mm.
And that includes drug abuse. I mean, why were we so interested in COVID, but not interested in drug abuse? Because drug abusers are not as good as I am. Well, I tell a story. Many years ago, I taught a course at Jersey City State University, used to be Jersey City State College.
Mm-hmm.
And my students were recovering drug addicts, and they were studying for certification as drug counselors. They wanted very much to give the message that I try to give, which is don't touch these drugs, they're dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me, they surrounded me at lunch. And one of them leaned over to me and said, why do you teach this course? Are you an addict? I said, no, why? I teach it for payback. I like to teach
Yeah.
because only addicts are interested in us. And that was so sad
Yeah.
and so dismissive and yet factual. We
Right.
dismiss drug addicts. They're not as good as us.
Yeah.
They're crummy. They're not never amount to anything. Well,
Yeah.
that's rubbish. They're human beings
Right.
and they're sick.
Yeah. Exactly.
I
Yeah.
I, I
And
am passionate about this.
yeah, I don't blame you. And I'm passionate about it as well, because I do see the deaths. And I'm of the generation also that you were taught to tough it out more than to take a pain reliever. I mean,
I
some
think
people can't, but
I my memoir is Boomer Dad. I'm a boomer.
exactly. So it's the same thing. I mean, your mother wasn't going to give you a painkiller if you were in pain. She'd be suck it up. You know what I mean? And that's about it. So you had surgery or like this for a couple of days. But the good news is once you recovered from the surgery, you didn't have another problem, which we have with opioids because people have chronic back pain. They're on the opioids for a while. And I'm probably using opiates and opioids wrongly.
I
But
do it too.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, I
But that's a problem, is it the addiction? What do you think can be done? You mentioned leadership. What specifically do you think can be done as far as legislation goes to
well,
help change this issue?
I thought about that and wrote a chapter in my book thinking, what can we do to manage opiates better at the federal level? First of all, I said that opiate prescriptions should be centralized, not state by state, the way penicillin is.
Mhm.
Pardon me. If they're centralized and we eliminate paper prescriptions altogether,
Mhm.
we can have a way to track prescriptions. We can have a way for patients to stop doctor shopping.
Mhm.
We can have a way for someone like me who finds that if I went down to my drugstore on the corner and they wouldn't fill a prescription, I could drive 8 miles to New York State and fill it in New York State. Nobody
Right.
cares. It's a separate law.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't be. It should be centralized. And lastly, I said, I come from an industry where I was a project manager, and my teams had multidisciplinary membership. I had a physician, I had a chemist, I had a biologist, I had a marketing person, I had a regulatory affairs person, and I chaired the meeting. And I said, we were able to solve problems that I couldn't have solved if I were thinking about it sitting alone at a desk.
Mhm.
So maybe a multidisciplinary approach is the way to solve a problem. So I said, all right, what if the FDA, the DEA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse all reported to one person? We would centralize drug regulation and research and maybe solve problems more easily because we had a multidisciplinary approach. So I proposed a new cabinet member who would manage that.
Well,
I've not yet heard from the government, but
yeah, well, I think they're all great suggestions, particularly the fact if we had a nationalized system where we could see who is getting the prescriptions, that you couldn't go from one pharmacy to one doctor to the next, to the next, to the next, in hopes of turning a profit or fueling your own addiction. In your book, you also cover the history of opium and its impact on society. Tell us a little bit about that history and why you think it's important that we learn from it.
interesting. I actually started the book writing history,
Mhm.
and I thought, well, maybe there's a small market for history books. So, and then the book took over and
Got a life of
directed
its
me to
own.
write it.
Yeah.
And with a good deal of inspiration from everything I read. The history of opium. People think it comes from Yemen or somewhere in the Middle East. There's no evidence that it was out of Africa, even though because of exploratory activities on the part of the Western Europeans. They carried it to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But opium seems to come out of the Middle East. Now, how did it spread worldwide? Well, it spread worldwide because people discovered early on that there's a market for raw opium. In the old days, we used to say, you know, in the East, they smoked opium. There were opium dens.
Mm-hmm.
And then people discovered that morphine was a component of opium. And then one person who invented aspirin invented heroin by adding acetic acid vinegar to salicylic acid, and he created aspirin. But he also created heroin out of morphine. Excuse me, I have to tell this person they can't speak to me right now.
Sure.
And where was I? Oh,
The development of heroin and aspirin, and
he gave the product the name heroish, heroin, in German, and it lasted all these years, and yet it's never been marketed. And so we discovered heroin as a result of his chemistry.
Amazing.
And aspirin is still on the market.
Is there any legitimate purpose for heroin?
No, there's no market.
Medicinal, no.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all.
What about fentanyl? Is there a legitimate use for fentanyl?
I was given fentanyl last year during a minor surgical procedure I had.
So it's used during surgical procedures?
Its original use was as a surgical anesthetic. The heroin that's sneaking into the United States, I am sad to say, comes out of Mexico. But the Mexicans don't make it. They merely take the pieces sold to them by the Chinese and create heroin from the pieces the Chinese give them. That's why the DEA has begun monitoring the sale of some of these chemicals. And then it's smuggled into the United States. It's not smuggled in on the back of the immigrants coming across the Rio Grande. It's smuggled in on the back of a semi-trailer.
And its components, raw components.
In autos.
Yeah.
And that's how it gets into the United States.
Now, do you feel that China is flooding our nation with fentanyl and heroin as some type of passive-aggressive warfare, or simply for monetary reasons?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I believe it's warfare.
Yeah.
I believe the Chinese are poisoning the United States.
Yeah.
And I am on the United States case saying perhaps you should go after China and convince this totalitarian government to get control of this horrible scourge.
Yeah, absolutely. The other question I have when it comes to drug use and illicit drug use is, I agree with you that people who are drug addicts should not be treated as criminals, unless, of course, they're dealing in large supplies and so forth. But we have approved marijuana use in this country on a recreational basis, on a medicinal basis, in almost every state in America now.
I believe it's 22 states.
Oh, okay. Only the 22 states I'm in, but I'm teasing. But it seems like it's everywhere. I mean, that's half the United States, 22 states or thereabouts.
They opened a marijuana store down the block from me.
Yeah. I mean, so there's dispensaries everywhere. Aren't we sending a real mixed signal that drugs really aren't bad if they just got a bad rap? And don't you think in many ways, I don't know anybody who became a drug addict who did not start with marijuana. So we can argue all day whether it's a gateway drug or not, but I don't know anyone who didn't go from smoking cigarettes to smoking marijuana to doing
marijuana is somewhat off my subject, but
right.
I'll address it briefly. I believe marijuana is not a gateway drug.
Mm-hmm.
However, I also believe that we were taught for many years, our whole lives, marijuana is not a gateway drug and it's not addictive. And yet there is something called a marijuana use disorder that people who use it chronically find they can't stop using it and behave as though they're addicted.
Mm,
Now that I haven't read about it enough, and I
right.
hope to write a book on marijuana,
Yeah.
but I stuck to opioids in my book. I
Yeah.
didn't go near marijuana.
Yeah.
Uh,
I only got you off track a little bit there because as far as impressions go, you know what I mean? We talked about being boomer babies before or boomer dads and having strict rules. When I was a kid, if you went near marijuana, I don't know what my parents would have done. You know what I mean? They were that strict. I mean, there was, that type of um, line in the sand.
I don't know that my folks knew of marijuana.
Right, exactly, exactly. But if it was any kind of drug, I'm sure they would have had a fit. Let's get back to your book and tell me what you hope readers will take away from this and why it's important that all Americans read this book.
Well, I feel strongly, number one, they will learn the facts about marijuana. And I coined a phrase. I said, these drugs are baited hooks. Don't get caught.
Yeah.
That's all I say. You have to have an opiate because you're in pain or you're going through surgery. Go take it, but stop afterward. And understand that if you don't stop, the drug won't leave you alone.
Yeah.
They are that dangerous. Secondly, I want people to become active. I say we live in an asocial society. We stare at screens. We don't talk to each other anymore.
Exactly.
My son stares at an iPad all night.
Right.
I have a
I know.
14-year-old. I also have two older ones. Uh, and I'm single parent to the 14-year-old. Where was I?
We were talking about opioids and what people will
Oh, the
take away from your
takeaway from
book.
my
Yeah.
book. Yeah, I think we have to talk to people. I think we have to be helpful. I think we have to look at an addict and say, not what a horrible person you are, but how can I help you? Can I make a phone call on your behalf? Can I Google rehab for you?
Yeah.
If we find an unconscious addict, we're duty bound to save that person's life. How do you do that? You call the ambulance. They come and squirt naloxone up his nose, and magically he wakes up. There are ways we can help. We don't have to run for office. God knows I don't want to. But nevertheless, we can be helpful to our neighbor. I lost a first cousin because he was killed during a drug raid when he was 14,
Yeah.
my son's age. It's still a tragedy
Yeah.
many years later. That's my takeaway from my book.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, this is such an important book because the crisis is real. The crisis is rampant. It's an epidemic. And like you said, it's killing more people than COVID killed per year. And we have all these protocols for COVID. I mean, as an actor, I'm COVID tested constantly. Somebody's sticking a swab up my nose to make sure of it, but nobody's drug testing people to see if they're opioid addicted, which is much more lethal and much more prevalent and much more deadly amongst people my age and younger. That's for sure. Um, Education, how important is that? That schools teach the dangers of opioids and opium and
I
opiates.
don't subscribe to the idea that schools should teach the danger. I think they should teach the truth.
Hmm.
The truth will tell you of the danger,
Yeah.
but at least you'll base your knowledge in fact and not on what you read on a social media page.
How deadly is fentanyl? I mean, I hear stories about people just touching a little bit of the substance and passing out. Tell us a little bit about its toxicity, how lethal it is, the danger.
Fentanyl's scary fact is that it's so much more potent than morphine. Now, morphine is the classic drug we give for a broken bone, for example.
Mhm.
Fentanyl is what I received when I had to sleep through the minor surgical procedure I had 2 months
Right.
ago. Fentanyl is between 10 and 100 times more potent than morphine. The usual clinical dose of morphine is 10 milligrams. An injection of 10 milligrams will cover any pain any human has.
Mm.
An injection of 1 milligram of fentanyl is sufficient to cover that and put the patient to sleep. So, fentanyl is extremely potent. That's why it substitutes in most drugs today. That's why we see it added to speed. We see it added to heroin. We see it added to every drug out there because it's easy. It produces an effect at a very low dose. The danger is the clinical dose of 1 milligram and the lethal dose of 2 or 3 milligrams are not that far apart.
Right.
And I know I don't have a scale that will measure 1 milligram.
Right.
And I have a very sensitive electronic scale in my kitchen because
Right.
I bake all my own bread. But
Yeah.
but I do.
Yep. I
But
believe. Uh,
but uh but I can't measure 1 milligram of fentanyl.
yeah. Do you feel most people who OD on fentanyl or opiates don't realize what they're taking, particularly they don't realize that it had fentanyl in it?
Oh, I'm sure they don't realize that many drugs are contaminated with fentanyl.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the game that certain people are playing. Trick them into taking fentanyl. It expands our market and kills them. Too bad.
Amazing.
I don't want to be cynical, but we have an issue,
Yeah.
a national issue. And
Well, wasn't it Robert De Niro's like nephew who recently died of a fentanyl overdose also? I mean,
it
it,
could
it's
be, it
it's
could be.
hitting every stage of America, every socioeconomic group, that's for sure. And the reason why these drugs are laced with fentanyl is because it's cheaper to produce them that way.
It's cheaper and it's so potent, a little bit will do you.
Yeah,
I mean, the average size of a smuggled fentanyl package is about 2 or 3 pounds, maybe a kilo, kilo and a half,
yeah,
hidden in a semi-trailer filled with corn. Well, how would you ever find that?
yeah,
I propose that the government pay some technical company to invent a sniffer that will sniff out the heroin in a 14 tons of corn.
yeah.
I mean, if my cell phone will open my garage and turn the heat
Exactly.
on in my car, they ought to find a sniffer that can sniff heroin in a truck.
Exactly. In this digital age, anything can be produced, anything can be invented, provided there is motivation on the part of governments to do it. That's for sure.
And funding.
And
Someone has to
funding.
pay for it.
Exactly. Um, Before we leave you today, I want to ask you about Narcan. How important is it that it's kept in schools, kept by police officers, paramedics? I mean, believe it or not, it's controversial. Some people don't think people should be armed with it.
I believe firmly that it should be everywhere.
Mm.
And I shouldn't have to fish out a credit card to take to get a nasal insufflator so that I can save someone's life.
Exactly.
Narcan is now over the counter. We used to require it used to FDA used to require a prescription. Now it's over the counter and it's available as for nasal insufflation. You squirt it in the patient's nose and it's absorbed by the nasal membranes and the addict wakes up and starts to breathe again.
Yeah.
It's vital. It's a lifesaver
Yeah.
and it doesn't produce withdrawal.
And it's available pretty much across the country in pharmacies, if you
It's
have to
available in
pharmacies.
pharmacies. It's still expensive.
Mhm.
I'm adding it to my car
Yeah.
just because I feel responsible for the public.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I'm not a physician.
Absolutely. Barry Gold has written an important book. It is called We Are Overdosed. It is an insightful work. The author delves into the history of opium, the development of opioids, and the global pharmaceutical industry's birth, all while offering perspectives on gaining control of prescription opioids through federal legislation and addressing the tragic overdose epidemic. As we said in the beginning of this interview, somebody you know has either died from an opioid overdose or somebody you know knows somebody who died from an overdose of opioids. That's 2 degrees of separation. It's a real tragedy out there. It's a real epidemic out there. Again, in the beginning, we said in the 1970s, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. It's time that the United States of America declare a war on opioids. Barry, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
I thank you, and I enjoyed this, and it was a pleasure meeting you, albeit electronically.
Exactly.
If you have a
In our
copy of
ACE,
the book, I'd be happy to sign it.
okay, sounds great. I appreciate that. In our asocial society, like you said, it's kind of part and parcel. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.
I'm Barry Gold. Bye-bye.
Visit www.greatwritersmedia.com. Email us at info@greatwritersmedia.com. Call us at 877-600-5469. Subscribe now.